This next short video will talk about the oxygen consumption during recovery from exercise. And then in a future video, I'll talk about the lactate shuttle and the lactate threshold. So for this video, I'd like to talk about the oxygen deficit and oxygen consumption during recovery, and that is abbreviated EPOC, EPOC. So what is VO2, or what is oxygen consumption? Well, V is for volume, and it's typically liters or milliliters, and obviously O2 is oxygen. So it is the volume of oxygen that's consumed, and it's usually measured per minute. So it's liters per minute, or maybe milliliters per minute, or if it's a relative value, it's milliliters per kilogram body weight per minute. And oxygen is being consumed as the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. And that's happening in the mitochondria, and that allows those electrons to go down the chain and allows us to form ATP. So oxygen consumption then is directly related to work, or is directly related to intensity of exercise. If we would start exercise, and if we would measure oxygen consumption at the beginning of exercise, there's a little bit of a lag time. So here's a graph. On the y-axis is oxygen uptake or oxygen consumption in milliliters of oxygen per kilogram body weight per minute, so it's a relative value. And on the x-axis is time in minutes. And so here's a resting VO2 of under 5 mils per kg per minute. And at this point in time, the person starts to exercise. But there's a little bit of a lag time, and here maybe it takes 5 minutes until they achieve a steady state, where the oxygen consumption and the ATPs that are being met by that aerobic energy system are equal to the ATPs needed to run. And so there's a little bit of a lag time until that steady state is achieved. And depends on the exercise intensity, but a steady state will usually be achieved in a couple minutes worth. And that lag time at the beginning of exercise is called the oxygen deficit. And it suggests then that the beginning of exercise involves anaerobic pathways that are going to contribute to the ATP production. When that runner started running, they needed a certain number of ATPs to run. But it took a couple minutes worth until the aerobic energy system would meet the demand. So until that happens, this runner was using anaerobic energy systems to meet that energy production. And once steady state is reached, then the ATP is met through aerobic ATP production. So that graph, and here's just another example of it, sort of the beginning part of that graph is called the oxygen deficit. So this sort of shaded in part of the graph until we achieve steady state. That's called the oxygen deficit. It's always been sort of questioned, how can we measure that, right? So it's relatively easy with an oxygen analyzer, or you can estimate it by heart rates or something to measure the aerobic energy system. But how to measure that anaerobic component at the beginning of exercise? And originally it was thought that one can estimate that by looking at the oxygen consumption during recovery. And originally it was thought that can this be a way to measure that deficit at the beginning? So can the oxygen consumption above rest at recovery, can that be a measurement of that deficit? And the answer is no, and it's not completely true. Maybe partly true, but not completely true. So now that recovery oxygen consumption, it's no longer called O2 debt, because originally it was thought, this recovery is paying back the oxygen needed at the beginning of exercise, but that's not completely true. It's no longer called O2 debt, and that's sort of an incorrect term. And the term that is better used, the abbreviation is EPOC, and that's the oxygen consumption uh, uh, above during recovery. So it's the oxygen consumption above or during recovery. So let's look at a graph, and we can just look at panel A on the left-hand side. Here's the oxygen deficit at the beginning, and it was thought that this shaded in portion at the end during recovery, it sort of equals the same area of this oxygen deficit. So maybe they're equal, and maybe that is a way to sort of give a measurement of how much anaerobic component is being used, because this debt is paying back the beginning. But that's not the case. And there's more going on during recovery than just paying back the debt, that deficit at the beginning of exercise. So it was thought that this O2 debt at the end of exercise was payback for the deficit at the start of exercise. But it's too simplistic an answer. So a better term now, a more descriptive term, is EPOC, which stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, EPOC. So a better term for this area during recovery, and I typed it out and put in big arrows, is called EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. So if it's not payback, if it's not an O2 debt that is paying back the deficit at the beginning, then what are the causes of this EPOC? Why do we have this elevated or excess post-exercise oxygen consumption? That runner is no longer running. They stopped running. So their demands for ATP to run are no longer the case. So why are we consuming oxygen during recovery? So we'll come up with a list now of causes for this EPOC, or causes for this excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. One cause is resynthesis of stored phosphocreatine, and that's the immediate energy system. And actually, this is payback, right? So that is an anaerobic energy system. And so some of that oxygen at the end of recovery is paying back this phosphocreatine system. So that is part of a payback. Also, it is replacing just some stored oxygen. So some stored oxygen in the muscles, stored oxygen in the blood, and that would not be a payback. That is another cause of EPOC. Obviously, body temperature is elevated during exercise, and that stays elevated during recovery. Also, catecholamines are a group of hormones called epinephrine and norepinephrine or adrenaline. And those hormones are elevated during exercise, and they stay somewhat elevated during recovery. They don't immediately go away. Epinephrine will activate glycolysis. So epinephrine will turn on the breakdown of glucose, and so you're more you have a better ability, or you want to be consuming more oxygen. And with an elevated body temperature, different enzymes or enzyme systems remain sort of activated or turned on. So they'll be consuming oxygen when we, even though we don't have an external demand for ATP. Another payback is gluconeogenesis. So the lactic acid or lactate that's formed during fast anaerobic glycolysis going to gluconeogenesis and the formation of new glucose, that would be sort of payback. So that is correct. Obviously, during recovery, heart rate is still elevated, and ventilation, your breathing rate, is still elevated. Both of these physiological systems require some energy in the form of ATP, and it's not external work that is being done, but it is internal work, right? Heart rate is beating faster than rest. Breathing rate is a little bit above rest. So ATP would be required for those different physiological processes. So originally this was called an O2 det. That is no longer the term that we use, and a better, more descriptive term is epoch. And here is a list out of our textbook. And also now, hopefully you understand how this list can result in an excess or elevated post-exercise oxygen consumption, or EPOC.